This is for a really good friend of mine who is looking for some answers, like we all are. And I wrote it, oh my gosh, 9 years ago maybe. And it's a short book. It's called Really Knowing God. It was inspired by another book called The God's Honest Truth. And here goes. And the first scripture is, let be and be still and know, recognize and understand that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. And that's from the Psalms, chapter 46 and verse 10. At that time, it was the most tired, beat-up looking group of people I could remember seeing ever. As I stood there in front of them, holding the grape juice communion tray, I remember thinking, wow, do I look like that? That particular Sunday morning during the early 90s was the first time I had been asked to serve the Lord's Supper since I was a teenager. I was nervous about it. As a matter of fact, I was so nervous that I had written my little prayer I was to say before passing out the grape juice on an index card. The auditorium at the Church of Christ was full of people, tired-looking people. People who, for the most part, probably would have been better off staying at home in bed that Sunday morning. Really, no one I remember seeing that morning looked as if they had waited upon the Lord and renewed their strength at all. I know for certain I hadn't. For the most part, we were just going through the motions of what churchgoers do. Why? For the same reason our parents did it, which was the same reason their parents did it. No matter how half-hearted, tired, and miserable we were, we must go to church. Really. Why? Because the vast majority of us church-going Christians have been taught that the God is going to get us if we don't. So, there we sit, waiting for the preacher to give us another conflicting viewpoint of their God. Now, how's that going to get us to heaven? I've got news for you. Going to church is not going to get you to heaven. The preacher has nothing to do with whether you get into heaven. That, my friends, is between you and the God. Whether you dwell with the God when you leave this life is only between you and the God. More news. The God is not out to get you if you don't go to church every Sunday. He's not out to get me, and I don't go at all these days. Back to the auditorium. I prayed over the grape juice, and we did our mindless traditional ritual of serving it to everybody. Then we sat down and listened to another mindless traditional sermon. Then we mindlessly sang yet another traditional invitation song. Then someone who probably had a lot of money mindlessly and traditionally dismissed everyone with the prayer, "God, guard and direct us," or other mindless tradition. Then we went out for a mindless traditional lunch. Then we went home, watched something on TV, and took at least one mindless traditional nap. Why? We were tired as hell. And many of us couldn't wait to get the motions of church over with so we could rest. In other words, having been taught by my mother primarily that not going to church was grounds for eternity in hell, I wanted to make sure I stayed on good terms with the big guy in the sky. Just enough to make it through the pearly gates before they closed. The formula for that was simple. Get up on Sunday, put on some nice clothes, race down the street at the last minute, smile, act happy, try not to go to sleep while sitting there listening to Brother So-and-so's version of the Bible that he probably learned mindlessly and traditionally in a seminary. Eat a cracker, drink some grape juice, sing an invitation song that probably 4 people per year actually responded to. Go home and try not to cuss too much next week at work. Sound familiar? I bet it does. And what does all that have to do with really knowing the God? Well, it's better than doing nothing. And the God who loves me more than I can possibly imagine let me do that until the time was right, spiritually speaking. Then he put me in front of those poor, miserable people with a mindless, traditional grape juice tray in my hands and gently began to show me just how ineffective religious tradition is. Just as Jesus showed the God's people during his brief time here. At that point, whether I realized it or not, my quest to really know God began.